Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Fellows public presentation. I'm Sharon Bromberg-Lim, the Associate Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to introduce Radcliffe Fellow, Rachna Reddy. Take a moment to think about some of the most important memories of your life. Though we all have different life experiences, one common thread is that we may likely recall a memory from adolescence, a period of physical and social transitions that contributes to shaping our identity as we enter adulthood. Evolutionary anthropologists like Rachna Reddy tell us that humans are not alone in navigating this turbulent time. For over a decade, Rachna has researched adolescence in wild chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest living relatives, in order to understand the evolutionary foundations of human development and social relationships. In Rachna's field work, every day is an adventure. In order to observe chimpanzees and bonobos and document their social behaviors, every morning she hikes for miles through the lush forests in Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Rachna's observations offer a window into human social development by revealing how social relationships form among young chimpanzees and bonobos, and how these relationships contribute to social learning, well-being, and survival. While at Radcliffe, Rachna is working to better understand the unique vulnerabilities of adolescence. Drawing on her observational data, Rachna is analyzing the emotional experiences of chimps to trace the evolutionary origins of social anxiety. She's also writing a novel centered on a young chimp as he navigates coming of age, inspired by one of her study subjects. Rachna's hope is that her work draws people into the emotional lives of chimpanzees and will also advance research in human mental health. The Q&A portion of the public talk today will be moderated by Bob Keel, an independent artist and our David and Roberta Logie Fellow. And now, please welcome me in welcoming Rachna Reddy to the podium.
So, thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Sharon, for that introduction. The sound I just made is a pantoot. It is a long-distance call made by chimpanzees. One effect that it can have is if a chimp makes this call when they found a lot of food, it can draw many other chimps to that area. And when other chimps hear someone call, they know whose voice it is, and they can respond with a pantoot. And the fact that you all did not respond, I mean, of course, you are not chimpanzees, so that is why. But the fact that you didn't respond is what might happen to a chimpanzee during adolescence. They might call and not receive a response. So before I take you on this journey of research into this transformative life stage in the chimpanzee life course, I want to just take a moment to thank Radcliffe for this transformational year in my life as a person, a scientist, and that is to, thank you goes to everyone in the Radcliffe team, to all of the fellows. I feel so lucky to have had this opportunity at this moment in my career, and I'm totally changed by it. So thank you all. Adolescence. is a pivotal moment in the human life course. We begin life, like most mammals do, by definition, totally dependent on a caregiver, who is usually a mother from whom we nurse. That's why we're a mammal. But when we grow up, our lives look very different from most mammals. We have many different types of relationships with many individuals of different age, sex, that mean different things to us. And that is very different from many animals. Many animals live solitary adult lives, or they might have a relationship with just a mate and their offspring. But we have, even in this room, we all have relationships with each other that contribute to learning, innovation, all types of things. But the moment in our life course where we really shift from a bond with a caregiver, so a life like many mammals, to a life that has all these different types of social connections, is in adolescence. And adolescence in humans shares many things with other species, but it also produces a unique paradox in the animal kingdom. Its transformational component of going from a developing individual to one who can sexually reproduce. Puberty creates that transformation across the animal kingdom, and some of the hormones associated with puberty even that they can regulate metamorphosis. So it's something in insects. So it's something that's really, really evolutionarily ancient. But in humans, that transformation takes a very, very long time, and it does not happen in a cocoon. So it happens over many years. So in humans, puberty begins, adolescence. Its end can be many, many years after that beginning. So think about like the middle school years, all the way into what we would consider adulthood. And adulthood usually has a social marker. In many societies, there's a cultural rite of passage. But if I were to ask all of you when someone is an adult, it might be a really difficult question to answer, and that's because it's murky. In humans, it's also murky. In chimpanzees, as we'll come to learn. This adolescence is a really long stage. It's not a fast transformation to adulthood, and it's not doesn't happen in the protection of something like a cocoon. Second, adolescence is a really, really vulnerable period of life. So from a perspective of just physical strength and immune function, it's the strongest and healthiest individuals have been up to that point. But despite that, there's a 200% increase in morbidities and mortalities during adolescence. And the vast majority of those are related to social and emotional problems and dangers. So why do we have such a long period that is so vulnerable in our life course? One way we can get at this question is by taking an evolutionary perspective and looking at the few other species that also have a period like this. So chimpanzees and also bonobos are our closest living relatives, and they also have a protracted adolescent life stage. And this is a life stage that's part of a very long, long life course. It follows a juvenile stage where they're weaned but haven't yet gone through puberty. So in that stage, they're like a protected, cute child, not yet a reproductive competitor to anyone in their group, followed by this adolescent life stage where they become a reproductive competitor. And they're not a child, but they're not an adult. And I just want to take a moment to share with you a story that can highlight what it means to not be a child and not quite be an adult for a chimpanzee. This is a story that takes place at Ngogo in Kibale National Park, Uganda, and which is my favorite place in the world. This is what the view looks like from breakfast there. They're not, there are some Ngogo researchers here who will tell you that the forest has grown in slightly. It doesn't look like that anymore. It did look like that at the time that this chimpanzee Damien was 9, right at the beginning of puberty. When Damien was 9, something happened, which is that his mother went on a consort. And that is a behavior where in chimpanzees live in big social groups, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, where individuals, like everyone can basically mate with everyone. But sometimes the male and female will go off together away from everybody else and have exclusive time being just with each other for several months. And Damien's mother left in this manner really abruptly. And he was suddenly alone without her. He had a fully adult brother who was in his late 20s at the time, and a little sister who was 4. So we thought his mother was dead when this happened, just because she left behind such a young kid, who actually was a child. But Damien took over care of his younger sister. So she started following him everywhere. He would show separation distress when parted from her. He would groom her, and she would follow him everywhere. And during this period, food ran really low in the chimpanzee territory. And Damien was going everywhere, leading his little sister, and they came across his older brother, Rollins. And suddenly Damien decided they were going to follow his older brother, a full adult. But his younger sister didn't realize this. She was just following him, and she got separated for a moment when he made this decision to shift away. And then suddenly she was just alone, standing there whimpering, like whimpering, and Damien was away from her, looking back, also distressed, grimacing, looking for her. But he wanted to follow the older brother, so he stood there between them, between the adult and the child, waiting, looking back, a behavior that we'll talk about in a moment, and waiting for the younger sister to follow. And finally she came screaming, ran into his arms, he picked her up and embraced her, and then they followed their older brother for the rest of the food scarce time until their mother came back. All right, so adolescence in chimpanzees is this period where Damien has some capabilities. He can move around the forest, he can lead his little sister, he can take care of her, but if there's another adult there, that adult is going to be much more capable. So for some of the more scientific components of what's going on, that adolescence is this period between the onset of puberty and when we see adult behaviors coming fully online. So an adult behavior might be something like being able to capably care for a younger individual, or be a parent. It also might be something like receiving a certain greeting from somebody else that means that you have higher status. So something like the moment Damien received that from an adult male, it might mean that he's fully an adult. So yes, begins with pubertal onset, ends with some kind of adult marker of behavior. The time when chimpanzees reach their adult height is somewhere around 15 or 16 years old. They also have a growth spurt, but then they can kind of bulk up after that. So they still are tall and lanky, sometimes into their early 20s. Okay, so studies of this adolescent period, studies that allowed me to see that story of Damien's life with his siblings, have contributed to a body of evidence showing that adolescence isn't this this paradox of a vulnerable adolescence isn't like a fluke in the evolutionary story. It isn't a constraint. It's not that adolescents just go through this vulnerable period because it takes them a long time to grow up. It really has adaptive value in itself. And that's the story that I'm going to tell you about today. Before I do that, I want to give you a bit of an introduction to this approach of studying chimpanzees in the wild and what that research actually looks like. Next, I will set the backdrop of the social landscape that adolescents live in, the groups of chimpanzees, and then I'm going to talk about 3 patterns of behavior, all of which shed light on how this period really has, the behaviors adolescents are doing are really adaptive, despite it being a vulnerable period in the life course. Okay. And what I'm sharing now is part of a bigger research program where studying chimpanzees at this place called Ngogo in Kibale National Park, Uganda, are at its heart, and I'm so grateful to have some of the Ngogo team here today. I'll highlight them later so you can be ready. This is the place I've worked since 2013, and 2 years ago I became the co-director of the site. I've also done comparative research on bonobos with Martin Sorbeck, who's also here. I'm very fortunate to get to have gotten to study both our closest living relatives in the wild. And then for certain questions, I also take a broader perspective, sometimes looking at convergent examples. And what that means is species that are really, really distantly related, but they have some of these similar parallels of like having a long adolescence. So those are like dolphins and elephants. Different things might have caused that long period, but if we look at the species that all have that, we can answer questions about what its function is. And we'll come to that at the end. But then I also have studied species that don't have this protracted phase, but are much more closely related, like lemurs and rodents are another example. Okay, so why do we study chimpanzees and bonobos in the wild? How can this help us understand anything about humans? So first, chimpanzees and bonobos are our closest living relatives. Even for them, we are their closest living relatives, not gorillas. That's wild for me to think about because gorillas are also furry and live in forests. And yet we're the closest. It's wild. We shared a common. We did not descend from them. We share a common ancestor. We don't know what that ancestor was like. They likely had traits of both chimpanzees and bonobos. But when we share a trait with both species, it's good evidence that our last common ancestor probably also had that trait. So it can tell us something. Things we share with both these species might be things that are universal in humans. Just like nursing is universal to all mammals, so if you think of it that way. And so one of those structures we share is a protracted adolescence. And this is something that by studying chimpanzees and bonobos in the wild in particular, we can understand patterns of behavior, things like relationships, that we wouldn't be able to understand if we only studied them in zoos, for example, which I think is a context in which many people are familiar with these animals. And I want to show you a video to highlight a complex behavior that can only be observed by doing these long-term studies in the wild. It also highlights something about adolescence. So as we watch this video, I'm going to walk you through what you're about to see, then I'll play it, and then I'll play it again. But here's a group of chimpanzees. All these individuals are known to us. At this time, they've been studied by researchers for about 20 years. So these are all mostly adult males pictured. There's one adolescent male, but that means that for most of them, for a large portion of their life, someone was following them in the forest every day. They are doing something called patrolling, which is a behavior where chimpanzees, a collective behavior where chimpanzees, as a group, many individuals in the group, or because any number of individuals in the group, will move to the edges of their territory, walk quietly, not make any calls, sniff, sit and listen for chimpanzees of other groups. And if they hear chimpanzees from other groups, they may go meet them and try to kill them. So it's a war, this is a warlike behavior. It is, or can be understood that way. It is something that we know increases their territory. When they kill many chimpanzees, they take over their territory. That leads to access to more food, and it leads to more offspring being born in the group. So it's, or is associated with all those things. So it's an adaptive behavior for chimpanzees in the group. It is also a behavior really, really associated with social bonds. So you'll see chimpanzees have spikes in urinary oxytocin, a hormone associated with bonding, during these patrols. So they'll often, there's a lot of touch, which you'll see in the video during them. It's part of being super, super connected to your community as you go after this other community. And importantly, a period in which involvement in these really heightens and appears to potentially be shaped is in adolescence. So when we watch this video, we will see a lot of elements of what I just described. These chimpanzees are quiet. It's a moment on the patrol where they paused and sat to listen. They are grooming each other slowly. They hear something, they turn. They start grooming again. They hear something, and then they all decide, there's a moment where they all suddenly react and rush forward. Before they rush forward, they all embrace each other and have lots of sociosexual behaviors, and these are all males. But while that's all happening, there is an adolescent in the scene who is off to the side, not touching anyone. Okay, so I'll point all of those moments out to you. Okay, so they're turning, they're looking, they hear something. That's the adolescent at the very front. You can see part of his legs. And now you see him alone at the very front, turning. They're grooming each other. They hear something. They run, they all embrace, and then there's two males that are having a ventral sociosexual interaction. Should we watch it again? Yes, okay. All right. And this is a video from 2015, so these individuals have actually, there was something like a civil war at our site, and they're no longer part of the same group. Okay, but yeah, there's Abrams as an adolescent at the front, alone, everyone else touching. Embracing. All right. So a moment of being bonded, a behavior that's really dangerous, something we only know this happens because they've been studied in the wild for so long. It's telling us something about adolescents starting to participate but not being fully involved. So, okay. So when we, you don't have to look at everything on the slide, I just want to highlight this is one example of a whole suite of types of data that are collected during field studies of chimpanzees and bonobos. We can learn so much from them, and there's huge value to these, to the existence of these studies and their persistence in the scientific enterprise and for conservation and a number of other things. And I'll just highlight some of the values of Ngogo. This speaks to a wide range of long-term projects like this, but a lot of discoveries have come out of the Ngogo Chimpanzee Project. It's one of the largest known groups of chimpanzees in the world, and chimpanzees live to the oldest ages there. we learned a lot about the nature and the evolutionary functions of this kind of warlike behavior, how important it is to form bonds with non-kin, the existence of menopause, and then critically, it's contributed to the training of so many scientists, both in Uganda and from around the world, and I am one of those trainees, and we have two of the current trainees, now leaders here today, Izzy and Sharifa, who can make a gesture if they would like. Okay. But all right, so many types of data we're collecting, we're doing so much, but I'm just gonna focus on a few data types in the talk that I'll share today, and those largely come from daily behavioral observations that we make as we're literally hiking in the forest after these individual chimpanzees and bonobos on their social behavior and relationships, and they come from knowing their individual identities and their chronological age, because we know when they're born, or at least shortly after they're born, and then also come from looking at sort of where they are in their development by the onset of secondary sexual characteristics that also are associated with different hormonal changes. I won't talk about those now. And largely, the data I'll show you represents a personal data set, so data that I collected myself, but with the intense training and work of many, many people who enabled me to do that, on 288 chimpanzees, from age newborn to 68 years, over 10 years. That's what I'll be drawing on. Okay, so field studies in the wild allow us to learn things that we could never learn without only studying animals in captivity, about the complexity of their behaviors and just the vast length of their lives. And for chimpanzees and bonobos in particular, they can really help us establish patterns that are universal in humans, so we can understand a bit more about ourselves. And humans are so varied in the ways we live, as you all know, that it can be hard to know what's shared. Okay. So next, I'm going to move into the story of how adolescence has adaptive value. And first, I'd like to set this backdrop of the complex and risky social landscape in which chimpanzee adolescence unfolds. So chimpanzee adolescence lasts multiple years, as I'll review again, beginning with the onset of puberty, ending with that sort of complex plastic marker of adulthood that's social, like it is in humans. It involves a social reorientation away from caregivers and into new social bonds in what's called a fission-fusion social system. And that term may be new to all of you, but we live in one. We live in a fission-fusion system. And what that is a system that, again, will seem familiar to us as humans, but it's rare in the animal kingdom. So it's one where you have many different individuals that you know and that you may consider to be part of your group, but you're almost never all together at one time. So you can go off and change company, you can have time alone. So we've all come together for this talk. Some of us will go off and have lunch together. Some of us might break off in other units. So this fission-fusion society where your company can change all the time is unique. So yeah, again, many animals are solitary. Some live in pair bonds where their pair bond is their whole world. Some quite literally, and everyone else is an enemy. Others may have social bonds within a group, but the group moves as one unit. So they literally have no alone time. And so what it means to come of age in a fission-fusion society is that you can make moment-to-moment decisions about avoiding or approaching social gatherings. But critically, that choice doesn't really come online until adolescence, because until chimps are about 12 on average, they spend most of their time with their mother, following around their mother. If their mother has died, they often have an adoptive caregiver, usually an adult male that they follow. So that moment-to-moment decision-making in chimps, like in humans, appears to create moments or feelings that we might associate with social anxiety. So here are two chimpanzees. They've heard others in their group, but they're deciding if they want to go meet those other individuals, and they have to hold each other before they go do that. So it's this moment of that you have before you go to a party, and we do call the subgroups parties. Before they attend a party, they might have a moment of fear. And that's something that they cultivate in adolescence, or how to get things like really having that moment where I don't just follow my brother, but I decide if I go or I stay, is something that comes online in adolescence. Okay, so it's a new decision-making thing that comes online. Okay, so it occurs in the fission-fusion social system where there's moment-to-moment decision-making about who you spend time with. Critically, it also occurs in a context in which, I meant to say that also that fission-fusion is something that we see in chimpanzees and bonobos, but not in the other great apes. So even if we look at the closest relatives to chimpanzees and bonobos, we don't see there's not a fission-fusion social system. And so what it means, even if we're comparing chimps and bonobos to their most closely their closest relatives, is that chimps live among, in this fission fusion social system, among their more capable competitors. So they become reproductive competitors. That might, and we'll get into this in a moment, but it might change how they're treated. But they don't have, in many species, the moment that happens, there's some kind of structural situation in which you avoid those individuals. You might become solitary, going off on your own, or in many primates, you join something like what's called a bachelor group, if you're a male. So you're just living with other males, you're not reproductively competing at that moment. You kind of, it's like we could think of them figuratively as cocoons, these types of protective cocoons where you're not directly having to compete with other individuals. Chimps don't do that. So they're out in their group, and that means that they are exposed to more threats. So here I'm going to show you, this is showing the whole chimpanzee lifespan, the daily frequency of aggression that individuals receive across it. And you'll see the adolescent years are highlighted in turquoise. It's a little light here, but you can use the bottom as a reference. And you'll see that in adolescence, chimpanzees receive threats they have never experienced before and likely never will again. They receive a ton of aggression. Okay, so chimpanzees, the backdrop, they're receiving these social threats they've never experienced before, they never will again. So the question is, do they avoid these threats? So even though, unlike gorillas and orangutans, chimps do not have this option to go live in a bachelor group or be totally solitary, in the fission fusion system, when they're making moment-to-moment social decisions, they might still decide to avoid certain individuals and perhaps not socialize at all. So we might have a hypothesis that that's what we should see them doing in adolescence. If adolescence is this period to simply get through, to wait till you're bigger and stronger, we would expect that they would be avoiding those types of threats. So a prediction, a prediction that would support this hypothesis is that chimps should limit investment in social partners during adolescence. To test that, we used several measures of social investment. I'll highlight two of them. One is something called travel vigilance. It's a behavior that you might have done if you entered in here with somebody and you held the door for them or waited for them. In the fission fusion system, it's very important because, remember, individuals aren't all together at once, and chimps can't, well, I guess they can make pant-toot calls like I made to all of you. But as they're moving in the forest, if they want to stay with someone, they need to follow them, or they need to wait and make sure they're coming, like Damien did in that story about his younger sister, where he got really scared and was waiting for her. So this is an example of it, a young adult male chimp waiting for his mother, but it reflects an effort to try to stay with that individual. So travel vigilance. Another is social grooming. So this is a behavior that happens in many mammals and primates. It's a form of affiliative exchange. It begins in infancy with family members primarily. In chimps, it spreads out to other relationships. And it seems to form the basis of a lot of cooperative behaviors. And it's very reciprocal in close bonds in adulthood. So bonds that last a long time have really equitable grooming among adults. Okay, so here's this figure is now zoomed in on just adolescent and young adult years. We see that peak in the aggression that they're receiving. So next I'm going to show lines for the travel vigilance that they give to others, and then the grooming they give, but also the grooming received. And I'd like to think of those in parallel, because it's not just the adolescents are giving grooming, it matters about whether that grooming is reciprocated too. So we see that they give in adolescence, despite receiving the most aggression they've ever received. They also receive they also give more travel vigilance than they've ever given before, and this is true for the number of social partners too. So they're not avoiding anybody, they're spending more time with more individuals than ever. Similarly, they are giving more grooming and without receiving grooming in return. So there's no social avoidance happening despite all these new threats. They're like, I want to socialize with everybody as much as I can. Okay. So critically, it might be that adolescent chimpanzees are just they're engaged in the social world more, so they're getting more threats. But they're also investing in all these other social bonds, and it might be that they're not actually getting threats from individuals that they invest in. What I just showed you, those age patterns, are just a product of being more social generally. So here, in this type of analysis, we're directly testing that. So we're looking at all pairs of chimpanzees in the whole community longitudinally, so looking at particular relationships and how they change over time. And this is a almost graph. is a prediction of the likelihood of a chimpanzee receiving grooming from somebody they invested in a given year, and the likelihood of receiving aggression from that individual. Grooming will be shown in blue, aggression in red, and whether they are an adolescent or any other age. So if we, and then just, this is an odds ratio plot, so if something is positive, so like you're more likely to receive grooming, it would be, or more likely to receive aggression, it would be over the line, and then if it's negative, it's under. So if we think adolescents are, yeah, okay, so I'll explain what that means in a minute, and then ignore for a moment, just ignore the top kin measure. Okay, so here we see when individuals are adolescents, they are more likely to receive grooming, or sorry, more likely to receive aggression from someone they invest in, and less likely to receive grooming. So it's not just that they're like making friends and then some individuals are aggressive to them, they're really investing in these individuals who don't really seem to like them that much quite often, and getting aggressed by them. Critically, we don't see that pattern when it comes to family. And here family are maternal siblings and mothers, the individuals they're with primarily before adolescence. So that we can take two things from this. One, that chimpanzees make these, for the first part, social investments that put them at risk for rejection and threat in both these dimensions. And then critically, that family members are an exception. And so this emphasizes a lot of past work showing, and I'm just highlighting some studies from Ngogo here, but that these early family bonds change in nature and function during adolescence, but they remain really important. And I just want to highlight that by showing this is an infant-mother bond, mother-son bond, and then these are can be bonds that last throughout life. So falling back on a family bond might be really important. So we don't see any support for this idea that chimpanzees are doing anything to avoid individuals that threaten them in adolescence. In fact, they proliferate their social partners. They invest in individuals who reject them and, like, by not giving anything back and threaten them. And a core takeaway is that it suggests that puberty in chimpanzees is really intensifying these social motivational proclivities despite risks. And critically, so my colleague and co-author on the study, Alexandra Rodman, is a clinical psychologist and neuroscientist, and she has done work in human adolescents showing that they have what's called a reduced self-protective response. What that means is that adolescents are more likely than adults to keep liking someone who rejected them. This is something we all do throughout life, but it's really pronounced in adolescents, even though they're more sensitive to being rejected, and that can have more of a negative impact on them. And this has been something that in clinical work has been thought to be potentially maladaptive or seen as like an immature behavior of adolescents, like something you should get them to stop doing. And maybe that's true. I won't speak to the intervention implication necessarily, but this pattern in chimps suggests that this is ancestral. Doing this just in adolescence is ancestral. And it's not something that continues into adulthood necessarily. And so if it's ancestral, it's shared with chimpanzees, that suggests that it could be, that there's like potentially adaptive value to it. So what's its function? And we don't have an answer to that, but I'll set the backdrop again for you toward a possible future question, which is that, so chimpanzees, when it comes to these non-kin relationships, these non-family bonds, tend to receive, as infants and juveniles, a lot of affection, tolerance, and even care. So here's an older infant chimpanzee just resting with an adult male. In adolescence, that affection, particularly between males, is withdrawn, so they don't receive that kind of cuddling, tickle play, airplane play that their younger siblings might still receive. And then it's replaced with a lot of aggression. So here you see an adolescent chimpanzee moving out of the way, grimacing and pant grunting to this adult male. And then in adulthood, though, again, on the bookend of that is to have these really close-knit, reciprocated bonds. So adolescence is this middle stage between receiving care, where you don't necessarily contribute to the relationship in the same way, receiving all this like rejection, and then being part of a really reciprocated, tight-knit bond, like we saw in that video, where they're basically off to war together. Okay. So it might be that having tolerance for some of that rejection and persisting despite it is really important for learning to form adult relationships. So now, okay. We'll recap for a moment. Do they avoid social threats? No. They have all this motivation despite them, and it might be necessary for learning about adult relationships. So next, I'm going to turn to the second adaptive pattern about how chimpanzees might be learning to form adult relationships. And to do that, I'd like to take you, I'd like you to look at this behavior that is unfolding in this photograph. So here we have one social behavior happening, social grooming. So here Damien, again Damien, everywhere Damien. Okay, Damien is grooming Renata, his younger sister, who in this is a young, just beginning adolescence. She grew up from that story where their mother was away. She's doing another behavior. She's closely observing the social interaction of Damien and Renata. And this behavior is called peering. It's been associated with social learning in apes. Okay, so peering is a way we can get at what chimpanzees might be motivated to learn. And so here I'm going to share a study that is led by Izzy Clark, who's here today. And she's a PhD student at UT Austin, has been working at Ngogo since late 2017. So if you have chimp questions, you can also go to her. And to Sharif and Namaganda sitting next to her. Okay. All right, so peering is directed, we find overall, and this is replicating work at other sites, it's directed at older individuals, it's infrequent in adulthood, it occurs in a variety of contexts. The two most frequent at our particular research site are feeding and social grooming. And so peering at feeding we would consider to be in the foraging domain, that it's probably about learning what to eat. And peering at social grooming is in a domain that could be learning about social relationships or potentially how to groom. Critically, chimps start grooming, all of them start grooming by age 2, so it's not something that we don't think it's just about grooming, but that's something we can talk about. Okay, so if we think that puberty is really opening this window to learn about social relationships, we would expect that peering in this realm of learning about social relationships, like a social grooming, would be higher than peering in the foraging domain. We would expect that it would be focused on non-family members over family members when they peer at social interactions. And then we also have a prediction that there are some reasons to think that just in the adolescent developmental window, it would be heightened in females compared to males. Why is that? It's possible that the need to learn really rapidly in adolescence is higher for female chimpanzees than for males, and that's for a couple of reasons. Critically, females simply have more to learn. They disperse and settle permanently in a new group in adolescence. This is something that's really unique in the animal kingdom. It happens in both of our closest living relatives. What it means, so in many mammals, if there's one sex disperses and one stays, it's usually males who leave and females who stay. And that's just for a lot of reasons. Like as mammals, they have a lot more, they benefit a lot more from having their kin around and their and resource, like food, knowing where food resources are because they have to raise their offspring. So, but chimpanzees, even when males disperse in other species, they typically disperse multiple times. But female chimpanzees disperse in this moment in their life, and they stay in that group forever. And just to highlight what that means, this is Marlena, one of the oldest chimpanzees I got to know at Ngogo. This is Moya, one of the oldest males that was alive in my time at Ngogo. She was probably, when she immigrated, he was probably an infant or not even born. So the oldest, these females make this decision in adolescence, they go into a community, and they are the oldest individuals in that community for their life. Okay. It also seems like there's higher stakes. There's studies suggesting that lifelong status for female chimpanzees is determined in the first year they immigrate. So it's quite literally like if things feel like life or death when you're 14, about like if you go to a party, maybe it is. Like it lasts for their whole life course. That's very different than in males for whom status can fluctuate throughout the life course and who aren't going into this new situation. And yeah, status in females determines all these is associated with all these suite of evolutionary fitness measures. Their avoidant outcomes are also a bit more extreme in adulthood. So female chimpanzees are more likely than males to be like super, super social, having a lot of bonds, or like I don't need to hang out with anyone, I just want to be with my kids. And males don't have they have adoptive kids, but they don't have that same like I have all my kids with me and I could be. They're more likely to be social, even though. Even the extremes could vary. Okay, all right. So yes. So adolescents, females are making this like super high stakes first impression. It appears. So we think that it might be really heightened, especially for immigrant females, is what we thought. Okay. So I am going to quickly go through some of this because I'm approaching. Yes, I spent longer than I planned describing some of those stories. Okay, but all right. So here we're going to look at peering frequency across the life course in the foraging domain versus the social domain. With adolescence, again, shaded in turquoise. So here you'll see when we look at peering in the foraging domain that it peaks around weaning, so just when chimpanzees stop being nursed and need to feed on their own, that's where it's heightened, and it's declining in adolescence, it's still happening. we see a very different pattern when we look at peering at social grooming. When it comes to peering at social grooming, we see a second peak during the adolescent window. So it's peaking still in the juvenile stage, which broadly at other sites is when peering just generally across all contexts tends to peak. But that even though it's declining, it peaks again in adolescence just in this context. And critically, we see a sex difference just in the social grooming context just during adolescence, where females are grooming a little bit more than males. And importantly, we thought that this effect we expected it would be driven by immigrant females, but our data suggests that it's not, that a lot of this is happening in natal females before they disperse. So it's something about this moment of it suggests there's some kind of thing going on where females develop before they do this really profound thing, like make it move to a new community, settle there permanently, that something is happening that really enhances their capacity and motivation to learn about social relationships. It also suggests they're not just learning about particular individuals' relationships, but something broader about the nuances of how to socialize or something. Those are lingering questions. Okay. So this study suggests that, puberty does appear to be this window for learning, particularly about social relationships, and that's particularly heightened for females who have a lot that they need to do in this window of development from an evolutionary perspective. Okay. So next I'm going to just touch on a couple points in this next section. I'm happy to answer more questions about them. But in addition to learning to form adult relationships through peering, we also see that adolescents form special types of relationships that seem like they might contribute to learning. And so past work has shown that chimps and bonobos seek, and this has been described a lot in male chimps and in female bonobos, that they seek these elder individuals who aren't necessarily aggressive to them and follow them around. And they have been called in the literature mentors sometimes. They're often in our study population, they're often elders. Elders have ethnographically been described in chimps to just have, in both males and females, to have all this special status. They're given meat, they get groomed. Everyone calls, like if I was like the elder male whale once he gave a pantoot, like I did at the beginning of the talk, and the whole forest erupted. Like there were chimps in places like I didn't even know that they had been responding to Moya's call. So that happens. And this is an example of like the alpha male is like grooming an elder. And we find evidence that this is associated with some anthropological theories about how in humans there's status that's not just about if you're bigger or stronger, but if you have knowledge or some kind of special, some things like elder respect, celebrity, obsession align to this. You're not afraid of someone, but you defer to them. And so we see that there's maybe some evidence this is happening in chimpanzees by testing a suite of predictions, and I'm happy to talk about those. But we see that not only in our study population do males form these mentor bonds, but females appear to form them too, with elder females. Okay, and all of this emphasizes that one thing that comes out of a lot of this work and this mentor, this work on prestige status maybe having importance in chimpanzees is that bonding with others is a lot more important than dominating them. And this is something that was raised in early studies of chimpanzees, there's many lines of evidence that come together about this, but there's been a lot of emphasis on the need to compete and puberty being what governs that. But it seems like in these species where it's creating a long life stage, it might be doing something more complicated. And I'll just these are some findings from chimps that males can father offspring without holding high dominance rank. We actually see like a reduced amount of fighting among peers in adolescence, just in males. And that there's like a lot of caregiving behavior, particularly by males to younger individuals, not picking on them, rather than picking on them. Even behaviors that are well known in chimps, where males sexually coerce females, we actually see that like it appears, at least in the study population, that having affiliative bonds with females is like a critical part of that, sexual possessiveness. It's not, and if they're not good at that part, it doesn't matter how aggressive they are. Females are like, I do not like you, and I will not be spending time with you. It's like what's coercive is that there's a combination of things. So, right, so what does this, some takeaways from this. We see we can learn a lot. All the data I've shown you is only possible from studying these animals in the wild over many, many, many years. And that chimpanzees and adolescents experience these threats they've never experienced before and they never will again. Those new threats are something that happen to many other animal species in the wild because they become reproductive competitors at adolescence. But rather than avoiding the social threats, chimpanzees seem so motivated to form social bonds, even when they're rejected. They show heightened motivation to learn that's associated with how much they need to learn. in certain ways. And we also see that they have these capacities to fall back on their family members and potentially to form these bonds with mentors that might guide them through this process. And so when we come back to our original question of why do humans have this protracted vulnerable life stage of adolescence when other species just quickly grow up, one emerging answer, and it's still a question for the future, is that it appears to be that there's something important in chimpanzees and other species that have a stage like this about not just needing to compete, but really needing to cooperate and needing to be, like, going through puberty makes you a capable contributor. And so that learning to contribute is a really critical part of this stage, whether it's in a relationship or to your community, like in that boundary patrol situation, or in humans could have a whole vast array of applications, whether it's that you get a job or you help take care of your siblings. These are all things that might have really important motivational value in adolescence. And interestingly, in certain societies, in adolescence, there are things that are being taken away, responsibilities that are being reduced for adolescents, while other things are emphasized that might be important for their success later in life, like high test scores, doing well in school, but might not provide the same kind of emotional feedback that some of these types of contribution, when you really make a difference to someone else, they may not produce that same kind of feeling. Okay, and so I just want to take, so we have a lot to learn, I think, about maybe why there's certain vulnerabilities adolescents are experiencing today and some of the fundamental components of adolescence that might be missing from our modern lives. And I just want to, I'll end on that note about this need to contribute to being a part of potentially chimpanzee adolescence and universal to humans. And then we have so much to learn from not only chimpanzees and bonobos. I didn't have a chance to discuss bonobos in this talk, but it's essential that everything I talked about, we need to know if it's happening in bonobos as well as chimps. And I just want to highlight that we have so much to learn from them. Adolescence is one component. These are a suite of other things. And then I just want to say thank you to the entire research team that allows all this work to happen, and including those of you who are here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachna, for an inspiring talk. Really great. So, it's fascinating to learn about chimpanzee adolescents, especially how they are more or less left to survive on their own, whereas the human parents continue to care for their children more or less throughout their lives. I suppose in both cases, the physical body matures before the mind, doesn't it? On that line, I was also thought about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The dedication to the author's father uses Adam's complaint to God in Milton's Paradise Lost, as where it says, "Did I request thee, maker, from my clay, to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" This evokes the nuances of adolescence reflected in the creature made by Frankenstein. They are a baby in an adult form, like a teen, capable of both gentle and violent acts, beautifully portraying the complexity of this stage of life. Do you identify some aspects of this in chimp adolescence?
So first, to answer your initial question,
Yes.
I want to clarify that there is actually so much of what I shared is centered on the adolescents themselves and what they're doing, and less on the parents. But critically, we actually see that parents have a very active role in chimp adolescence. There's a couple of potential differences, but I'll maybe just first highlight what they do, and then I'll come into the sort of Frankenstein motherhood thinking, raising questions. But I think, so first, both chimpanzees and bonobos have really, really long dependencies on their mothers, especially bonobos. Let's just go into shout out to Martin, who's not here. But so first, we see that chimpanzees need their mothers until studies that map how long an individual survive with whether or not their mother's alive and how early they reproduce have shown that they need their mother until they're about 16 years old, which is like into that adult period. Bonobo males, so their second closest living relative, need their mom their whole life, basically. They don't reproduce. They rarely reproduce. It's the biggest predictor of whether or not they reproduce is whether their mother is present in the group. Okay. There's a couple of people here studying this, but I think this particular question they've left. Okay, but we actually see that not only that, but like the mother being physically present is very important for sons to be able to mate as bonobos. So they're basically dependent on their mothers their whole life, bonobo males. Chimpanzee males at least until they're 16, but even after that we have instances where we see that 1/3 of males are best friends with their mother as chimpanzees, meaning that's one of their top bond partners, but all males, even when they're, or not, most of them, when they're adults, they still spend a lot of time with their mother. So it's a lifelong bond. We see that like effect of survival, like other fitness measures until they're 16. But actually, anecdotally in our community, we have instances where where males have been attacked by another group and their mother has saved them. So it's the mother-son bond is something really important throughout life. And then something when it comes to fathers or just other parents. And I guess I'm thinking they don't have to necessarily be fathers, they could be adoptive mothers. But so chimpanzees, in contrast to humans, from the time they're born, and bonobos are primarily cared for by their mother. That's who nurses them. That's different from humans, where humans tend to have multiple caregivers, not only their mother, and who could be many different types of kin or institutionalized in ways we create in different societies. But chimps, in the event that their mother dies, they're often adopted. They're often adopted by their older brother, if they have one. If they don't have an older brother or their older brother doesn't adopt them, they're often adopted by a male who might be unrelated. Sometimes they're adopted by a female who has kids, but it's these males really take on that, seem to be the ones that take on that parent role and like fill that need. There's also, and that's true in bonobos as well, or male adoption. But then there's also this one backstory to that. I promise this is all going to come together to the adolescent story. That backstory to that is that in gorillas, so that outgroup, fathers are really important. So there's no detriment. Like a female gorilla can raise a kid to be about 3, like just weaned, which is a little earlier than in chimps, and then leave the group and leave him behind, or leave the kids behind with their father, the silverback, who's most often their father, and then that male like carries them, sleeps with them in a nest. The kids spend most of their time like playing on the silverback male. So there's this like history of like fathers being super important in gorillas. They're a little less centralized in chimps and bonobos, but they still have this role that they take on as adoptive parents. And then there's a second moment in time that it's really important. And you know those mentor bonds that I described of a young male follows an elder male as he goes into the social world of males. That's something that's very scary for them. They sometimes whimper and cry and look back at their mom and at the males and are like, where do I go? And they might have to touch this older male as they go in. So my colleague Erin Sandell has shown that those males are often their father, if their father is alive. So it's like and that's really astonishing because there's this, everybody can mate with everyone, so there's not like these really exclusive mating bonds. So it's like and the mechanism is thought to be still under study that it's these friends of their mother that they're like, I'm scared, I'm going off on my own, I need to be with these friends of my mother. And so there's a lot of guidance. And then whether the that like molding, like that they have this child that is unknown to them, I'll speak to that like a little bit of just my feeling that I think for something we don't see in chimps, or at least, I would know, curious if others have seen it, that we've seen humans, is that like the letting go of the daughter in particular, that they go off, there's no conflict between the mother and daughter about that departure. And daughters might even spend more time with their mothers in adolescence than sons do before they fully leave. So it's not, but we see no distress by the daughter to the mother. So when the son is crying, like, do I go off or do I go with my mom? Like, that kind of crying behavior happens in adolescent males with their mother, and then we don't, at least two studies, we haven't seen it in adolescent females. They're just gonna like, bye mom. And so there's something though about like, I don't know what it is, like they must miss the kid, like they don't know anything about what the kids are doing. When they have a kid in their own group who's even grown, they are trying to, I don't know I can't speak to what they feel in the way that it's articulated about who they're going to become or like what they created, but they're very concerned with the well-being of their kids. I do think that females seemed, and I don't know how to scientifically quantify this, have really different relationships with each of their kids. And they seem to like mesh well with some and some not. So like that picture of the male looking back for his mom, that was in, his mom really likes him. And I think she's struggled with at least the youngest after him, who's very like wants to be like held all the time. I don't know. There's like a difference in personality, and so I don't know if it really speaks to that. But right, they don't have to do it.
It's nice to hear about the bonding process. And then there's this question. Next question is, what are the causes of conflict between groups? Is it always material or resource related? How do they resolve conflict and maintain peace? It's a big one.
So on a group level, I'll speak to 2 points. When it comes to the group level in chimpanzees, we in the past, it's been the case that a lot of this intergroup lethal aggression, like collective lethal aggression, territorial expansion was happening between groups that weren't both studied and had never been part of the same group. So totally new groups. And so in that context, we don't know what the driver is other than that they take over like feeding trees. Sometimes some of the escalation of that fighting can happen in periods where there's certain fruits growing. So it's like this access to these feeding groves in an immediate period of time. And it does seem like groups that are bigger, that have more like cohesion, are going to be better at that, but we can't always compare them to the other groups because we don't always know how many individuals are in the other groups. We have a unique situation that happened in our site, which has been very scientifically fascinating, very tragic, where there has been a civil war within the group. So one faction, in fact one that was smaller, a smaller subset of the group, has broken off and they've killed many, many individuals in the other group, the other side had taken over their territory. These are old friends, families, and in that case, it's very difficult to know what starts conflicts. So there's some conflict over resources potentially, but we don't have any evidence that in the territory as a whole that those resources were reducing. It could be breakdowns of relationships, just like happen in humans. So these are all questions we're investigating. The possibilities for peace might be something that come from bonobos, our second closest living relative, where there can be peaceful interactions between groups. And they don't seem to have, it's not that there's never, ever, ever any lethal aggression, but there's not this kind of collective warlike behavior. But there's also other differences, like the nature of bonding and things. Yeah, that may be where we see that. And then I also say within chimps, there's a lot of reconciliation after conflict in relationships. So they do a lot of things to maintain bonds within their group. And when it comes to the group fissioning, we could think about what could have been done, or what we could do in that context.
Okay, there have been so many questions coming in, but I think we are actually out of time.
Sorry, I gave too long a response.
Not at all. So I think we have to end here. Thank you, Rachna, for your interesting presentation and perspectives. Really, it's been such an enlightenment. And thank you for the audience to joining us. And I hope we will be able to join us for other Radcliffe's virtual programs. You can find out more about future programming and watching videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you.